So Paul, I updated the current status map from the one I showed you yesterday, and it looks like the Institute for the Study of War has now added Ukrainian protest locations.
I saw that, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to see that because there's now, yesterday I think there were 4 or 5 of them.
Yeah.
That the Russian occupied territories. Yeah.
Yep.
What I wonder about is how far Russia's going to go with annexing anything. Because it's speculation they want to annex the land bridge from Crimea to Donbass, or potentially even take over Odessa, get the whole coastline, which would make whenever Ukraine emerges landlocked and weak.
Right.
But I've heard no statements of that, so who knows?
I mean, is your sense that that's the sort of walkaway point that Russia could conceivably take?
I mean, I have no idea.
It's hard to see the Ukrainians signing on for anything resembling that, but
no, not at all. They would have to be defeated entirely and have nothing left.
Yeah.
Well,
I thought that I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, we're just chatting.
It's interesting chatting. Are y'all ready for me to kick this thing off?
Sure.
Okay, let me hit record right quick before I forget. Okay, we already got that recording. Okay, I wanted to thank everybody. Good morning. My name is Joan Johnson. I'm an assistant professor of government on the Connect campus, and this presentation is being sponsored by the Connect Civic Engagement team. We are very fortunate to have 2 guest speakers with expertise in international relations, and they're going to begin this event with an overview of what's happening in Ukraine, followed by a Q&A session. So please put your questions in the chat and we'll get to them as time permits. Without any further ado, let me introduce our guest, please. On the left, you'll see Dr. J. Michael Gregg. He's professor of political science and University Distinguished Teaching Professor at the University of North Texas. His research explores the onset and management of intrastate and interstate conflicts, with a particular focus on the use and effectiveness of diplomacy and peacekeeping to settle conflicts. Dr. Paul R. Hensel is professor of political science at the University of North Texas. His research focuses on territorial disputes, ethnic disputes, and river disputes between countries, and he is the founder of the Issue Correlates War research project that collects data on each of these topics. So let me turn this over to the experts. And again, thank you so very much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having us. So to start us off, I just put together a very sort of short overview of the conflict, just as a little bit of background. And so I thought I would just give sort of this short 7-ish minute overview, and then Dr. Hensel and I could just sort of alternate responding to questions. So let me share my screen with the presentation. Hopefully that's working.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Perfect. So obviously we're now 2 weeks into the conflict in Ukraine. And so just as a little bit of context, the country of Ukraine is actually a large country. So it's approximately the size of Texas. So this is a map here that sort of illustrates kind of the major cities of Ukraine. And you can kind of see where Ukraine is located relevant to Russia. So it actually shares a large border with Russia, but also shares some borders with some important US NATO allies, which is part of what I'm going to suggest is what makes this conflict particularly important to the United States, even though Ukraine is actually not a formal ally of the United States. Now, there's previously been a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Of course, Ukraine was a former republic of the Soviet Union. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine returned to a previous status of being an independent country. And in 2014, there was a conflict between Ukraine and Russia, where Russia occupied the peninsula here on the right side of the screen called Crimea. It was annexed and occupied by Russia in 2014. Russia claims it as its own territory, but that claim has never been recognized by Ukraine or by the vast majority of the international community. Now, another sort of relevant sort of topic here in the conflict that you've no doubt heard people mention is NATO and the aspirations of Ukraine joining NATO. So NATO is a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this is among the most important treaty organizations that the US is a part of. It was an alliance that was established in 1949. It's what scholars and security experts refer to as a collective defense treaty. So it's a treaty where the member countries of the alliance all pledge to come to the aid in the event that anyone is attacked. And in fact, there's a component of the NATO treaty called Article 5. And the language of Article 5 is very specific, that each country agrees that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. So this is why, in the event of an attack against a fellow NATO ally, the US is obligated by treaty to come to the aid of a fellow NATO ally. And so NATO includes countries like the United States and Canada and North America, and also includes countries in Western Europe, such as Britain, France, Iceland, Germany. Over time, NATO has expanded. So the countries that you see sort of in those lighter shades of blue, those are countries that joined NATO as part of the gradual expansion of the alliance after the end of the Cold War. This expansion included some countries that were former members of the Soviet analog to NATO called the Warsaw Pact. And so countries like Poland, like Hungary were members of the Warsaw Pact, Bulgaria, and are now members of NATO. And NATO also includes former members of the Soviet Union itself. So the Baltic republics, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia are now they're independent countries and they're current members of NATO. Now this is important because Ukraine, although not a member of NATO, has had aspirations to join the alliance. And one of the complaints that Russia has expressed is this concern about Ukraine joining NATO. Now, there are a few kind of background events. Ukraine has a very long history, but there are a few kind of background events that are really kind of important right here. This photo that I have here on this slide is from a series of protests that occurred in late 2013, early 2014, that have been referred to as the Maidan. And what set this protest in motion was that the Ukrainian parliament had signed an agreement, what was called an association agreement with the European Union that would more closely tie, would create what's called a free trade zone between Ukraine and the European Union and more closely tie Ukraine to the EU as kind of an intermediate step to Ukraine ultimately joining the European Union years down the road. The Ukrainian president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, actually pulled out of the deal. So he was actually a close ally of Russia, pulled out of the deal. This set in motion a significant level of protest in Ukraine at Independence Square, at the Maidan. The Ukrainian government under Yanukovych repressed the protesters. More protesters then flowed into the area. And ultimately, after months of occupation by the protesters, violence broke out in February 2014. And this set in motion what came to be known in Ukraine as the Revolution of Dignity. The president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, fled the country. 130 people were killed. Ultimately, Russia occupied the territory of the Crimea that I mentioned earlier and occupied some separatist area along the border with Russia called the Donbass. What ended major fighting was an agreement called the 2015 Minsk Agreement. And essentially, Ukraine agreed to provide limited autonomy for the regions in the Donbass in exchange for an end to the major fighting. And this is something that, again, Russia keeps kind of speaking to. Okay, so this gets us to current day. Immediately before the Russian invasion on February 24th, we see on this map sort of the massing of Russian military personnel along the borders of Ukraine, not just along the eastern border of Ukraine near the Donbass, where Russia has supported separatists, but also along the northern border of Ukraine, including in Ukraine's border with Belarus. Russia also massed troops in Crimea, and I think by most estimates, immediately before the beginning of the conflict, Russia had about 190,000 troops deployed against Ukraine. Conflict began on February 24th, and what we initially saw were a series of military strikes, airstrikes, cruise missile strikes against Ukrainian cities and military installations across the country. So it wasn't just confined to one portion of the country. Now, the status quo today, as of yesterday, this map here sort of describes kind of where Russia controls Ukrainian territory, how far they've advanced into Ukraine, and then as well as places where we're seeing protests against Russian occupation by Ukrainians themselves. And you've no doubt seen on the news images of these protests. And so what we see is that Russia has actually, the Russian advance has actually proceeded much more slowly than I think many experts expected. So Russia has still not yet been able to take the capital of Kyiv. They have military personnel nearby, but have still not been able to attack or been able to take the capital or remove the government. And so the conflict remains kind of ongoing. Now, the humanitarian effects from the conflict are dire. As of, I think, yesterday, the best estimate by the UN High Commission for Refugees was about 2 million refugees have actually fled Ukraine to date. And I think the forecasts actually point to as many as 7 million people ultimately fleeing the fighting in Ukraine. The official death of civilians, and we've no doubt all seen the images and the video of the harm that has been inflicted upon the Ukrainian population. The official estimate about 484 civilian deaths, but I think the best estimates from the US is somewhere on the order of about 5 to 6 times that have actually died. Now, an obvious question that I think many people are asking is, why should the US care about what's happening in Ukraine? As I said, Ukraine is not a US ally, it's not part of NATO. And I think the clearest answer here is that Ukraine is a democracy with aspirations to join the European Union and to join NATO. So there's sort of that shared democratic kinship that creates sort of the interest. Kind of more materially, or from kind of a more kind of narrow security perspective, Ukraine borders 4 NATO countries. And we know that violence and refugee flows that come with violence tend to have a destabilizing effect. And as I showed on the map before, many of the refugees are flowing into NATO countries. And so these have direct effects on countries that have a close alliance with the United States. As I mentioned, the forecast in terms of the number of refugees being produced by this conflict is quite dire, as many as 7 million people. There are also concerns that success in Ukraine could actually embolden further Russian aggression. So if Russia is effective in invading and occupying Ukraine and overthrowing its government, will that embolden Russia to attack a NATO ally, such as Poland, or attack the Baltic republics that are also part of NATO? And so many have argued that the US and its NATO partners need to hold the line here in order to deter Russia from striking somewhere where the US would have a much more direct security interest. And the other argument is that Russia's invasion actually upends the rules-based international order. We think about Europe as a very stable part of the world, but of course, throughout much of history, there have been lots and lots of conflicts in Europe, lots and lots of territorially based conflicts. And this is something that Dr. Hensel knows very well and can talk about in Q&A. And so the concern is that this may set sort of the precedent for future sort of territorial aggression and revising borders through violence rather than through negotiation. So in terms of how the US and its allies have responded, I think the best way to kind of think about it is that there are 2 battlefields for Ukraine. There's a military battlefield and an economic battlefield. On the military battlefield, the US and its NATO partners have made clear that they will not deploy military personnel. So there have been calls for a no-fly zone or things like that. And thus far, the US and its NATO allies have rejected all of those and said that they're not going to deploy military personnel to the conflict. Instead, the US and its allies are providing substantial amounts of military aid to Ukraine. So Stinger missiles, Javelin missiles, all sorts of weapons to better enable the Ukrainians to fight for themselves. The other battlefield is an economic battlefield, and this is the place where the US and its allies, not just within NATO, but actually worldwide, so including the Australians, the Japanese, the Koreans, have imposed what, to my mind, are the most significant economic sanctions ever imposed on a country. So President Biden just a few days ago banned the import of Russian energy supplies. Many Russian banks have been cut off by the SWIFT banking system. Russian foreign reserves, so the currency holdings of Russia, have been frozen in Western banks. There have been a variety of import-export bans on a variety of other Russian materials. Russia's been barred from dollar and euro transactions, which makes it very hard for Russia to make payments on its sovereign debt and things like that. And we've even seen corporate boycotts. So McDonald's has stopped operating in Russia. I think Kentucky Fried Chicken, KFC, has stopped operating in Russia. And we're seeing those sorts of things play out. The economic consequences, given the scale of these sanctions, have been dire for Russia. Russia is the 12th largest world exporter, so it is an important economy. Its key production, though, are largely things that you can dig out of the ground or grow in the ground. So oil, natural gas, but Russia is also a key exporter of corn, wheat. Ukraine is also a significant wheat exporter. Since the imposition of these sanctions, the Russian ruble has lost almost half of its value since January 1st, almost half of its value. In fact, this little cartoon that I have here, there's a children's video game that has the currency in the video game is called the Roblox, and it's sort of modeled on the ruble. the real world value of the currency in the children's video game is currently worth more than the Russian ruble is, to give sort of a sense of kind of the scope of the economic impact of the sanctions. Russia's responded by increasing interest rates and imposed currency controls to make it harder for businesses to access their foreign currency, to take currency out of the country. And right now there's a sharp recession forecast for the Russian economy. So the economic impact has actually been quite dire. So that sort of sets the stage for where we're at now, and I thought would be kind of a good place for us to just kind of talk about, take some Q&A, questions and answers, and just kind of work from there. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Now, Dr. Julie Lantrip, from Professor of Government from the Northwest Campus, is going to field some questions for you, and I'll be monitoring the chat.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful and answered a lot of student questions. We had over 100 though, so I'm going to group them together in specific topics. So we'll start at the beginning here. Many students asked why this is happening now. For example, one asked, is NATO expansionism to blame? Another asked, is denazification what's really going on in Ukraine? Is it because Putin wants to secure his place in a romanticized view of Russian history? Or is it because Putin has just lost his mind?
The answer to those is yes. No, there's a lot of reasons for this, and I'll try to get into some of them, and then Michael can jump into some more, Dr. Greg can. The Russian buildup seemed to start when Ukraine seemed to be starting to build up its military forces along the separatist regions. So the separatists in the Donbass region, Luhansk and Donetsk, have been fighting this war against Ukrainian military since 2014, since Dr. Greg mentioned that after the Maidan protests led to the change of government. And so the war's been going on there for the last 8 years or so. And recently, towards the end of last year, Ukraine was reportedly starting to build up a lot larger force there and started to use better weapons. So they started to use some of the Turkish drones that had been used in the Nagorno-Karabakh war a couple of years ago and were very effective for Azerbaijan there. So Ukraine started building up more of its forces along this and started using drones, which were, the rebels had no defenses against them. And Russia started to get worried. Now, that's not the only reason. That helps explain part of the timing of the start of the buildup, doesn't explain the full invasion of all of Ukraine. In terms of Putin's legacy, a lot of people speculate about that. And we obviously have no way of knowing what his long-term view is, how long he expects to remain in office. There's lots of speculation about his psychological or physical health, and we obviously have no way of knowing any about that. But that's certainly something a lot of people are speculating about. Mike, do you want to add something to this, Dr. Greg?
Yeah, I would say I agree with everything that Dr. Hensel said. I guess the only thing that I would add would be that, you know, in recent years, Vladimir Putin has made a series of statements that have really kind of called into question how he views Ukraine, where he's made some very specific statements that suggest that he doesn't see Ukraine as a real country, that he sees Ukraine as kind of a part of a natural part of Russia. So some have suggested, and again, this is a little bit of kind of trying to crawl into the brain of a foreign leader, which is hard to do. But some have suggested maybe that this is sort of, as he's ending his time on this planet, his effort to sort of create kind of that greater Russia that he sees as kind of the natural state of things, as kind of his legacy. I think that's part of what some people are pointing to as the timing.
And another thing too, it wasn't really so much NATO. I don't think there was much of a chance that Ukraine would have been able to join NATO in the next decade anyway. NATO certainly doesn't want to let in a member who's at grave risk of getting in a war and dragging everybody else in. And Ukraine's military, until this conflict at least, wasn't seen as maybe up to NATO standards yet, where you'd want it to be someone that would contribute positively to the whole alliance as opposed to dragging it down and bringing it into conflict. So I don't think NATO was really the serious concern here, but I do think Putin and the Russian regime were more worried about the European Union. Ukraine is a country that's kind of located right between Russia and the European Union members. And since it is so culturally close, now he's exaggerating by saying there was never a separate Ukraine or the separate people, so Putin exaggerates there, but it's close enough culturally to Russians, Ukrainians and Russians are close enough culturally that some Russians see Ukraine as possibly a model for them. And the closer Ukraine moved to the European Union economically, the more Putin and others start worrying that this could be something that our people start asking. You know, why can't we go to the same kind of thing. So there's some concern there that Ukraine could be a model for the Russian people, or for at least some large part of the Russian population. And that's something that, if you don't want to keep the current system, it's fine. But if you want to keep your current system, that's something you really can't tolerate. So I think in the short term, that was more an explanation for this. As Ukraine started moving more towards the West economically and politically, that this is seen as a dangerous model for the Russian people, as well as for some other interests of Putin. So I think that more than NATO explains kind of the pressure to do this sooner rather than later, I guess.
And I agree on the EU being kind of the decisive thing. The only other thing that I'll add really quickly is, I think we've heard the Russians use the term denazification as part of it. And I think that is kind of the clearest kind of red herring from the Russian side, that is really for propaganda purposes within Russia to justify what Russia is doing. There's nothing that suggests that the Ukrainian government is a Nazi government or led by Nazis. Volodymyr Zelensky has Jewish ancestry. He's a native Russian speaker. So he's about as far away, and the government is as far away from being a Nazi government as one could be. So the Nazi thing is really a way for the Putin regime to justify what they're doing to the Russian people.
Great, thank you. That was extensive. We had a lot of questions about where this is going, and we had one student who I think laid out in his mind like where he thought it was going or where she thought it was going. So I thought this was a great question. It's a compound question. Do you think Putin will prevail? If so, do you think he'll go beyond Ukraine? If so, do you think NATO will become involved? And if so, should we really be worried about World War III?
Small questions, right? Yeah.
Well, this is a great question. I guess I can start with this one, but there's plenty for us to chew on. So I know Dr. Hensel will weigh in. So I think in terms of, do I think Putin will win? When I talked about this with my students, I make the distinction between win and air quotes win. And so I think the chances of Vladimir Putin winning are extraordinarily low at this point in time. He may air quotes win. And what I mean by that is the Russian force is substantially larger and more powerful than the Ukrainian force. And so, all else being equal, it would not be surprising to see ultimately Russia prevail in this conflict. But what I think that would bring to Russia would be having to fight a sustained insurgent conflict against Ukraine that Russia has very little prospect of being able to win. So at best, it would be kind of a Pyrrhic victory. So maybe I'll turn it over to Paul for.
Yeah, so I agree with that. I mean, you look at military power, you can measure it lots of different ways. Every single way, Russia has a 3-to-1, 5-to-1, 10-to-1 advantage. So 5 times as many tanks, 6 times as many, or 8 times as many different armored fighting vehicles, warplanes, helicopters. So by any measure, Russia has much more of these things. And in many cases, they have newer equipment. A lot of the Ukrainian equipment goes back to the Soviet Union. Russia has been replacing more of theirs. So they have a lot more and newer equipment. So there's certainly every reason to expect that Russia, over the long term, can afford to take a lot more losses and still win some sort of a battlefield victory. So I don't think most analysts would be surprised if Ukraine ultimately loses the major cities, loses Kharkiv, loses Kyiv eventually. Now, it's become clear it's not going to happen as quickly as Russia thought. Russia seemed to expect a quick victory. I mean, Kyiv is only, I think, a 3-hour drive from the Belarusian border where some of the invasion started. And so the fact that it's now 2 weeks into the war and Kyiv still hasn't fallen, in fact, most of the suburbs of Kyiv have not yet fallen, suggests Ukraine's putting up a lot stronger resistance and causing a lot more damage than people expected. But still, over the long term, it's hard to see Ukraine being able to maintain this level of success. So I think there's a very real chance that Russia will capture the major cities ultimately if they're willing to keep taking these kinds of heavy losses. And the losses will continue to get heavy because NATO and the US and others have been sending lots of anti-tank weapons and anti-aircraft weapons, which really do balance things out a little bit. You start talking about city combat and tanks are vulnerable. Tanks are great for fighting in open fields and things, but when you start talking about city combat, tanks can't move very well when you're going on a street. You've only got limited mobility there. And my dog there. They get limited mobility and they're very vulnerable to anti-tank weapons and things. So just since the war started, NATO and the US have apparently sent over 17,000 more anti-tank missiles that have gotten through to the Ukrainian military. So I think their ability to impose really high costs and drag things out is improving. The Russians still haven't been able to cut the supply line. So these weapons having coming through Poland and Romania and traveling through Western Ukraine to get to Kyiv and places like this. So I think the ability for Russia to win a quick victory has long since passed. And so if there is a victory, it's going to be a long, drawn out, very costly thing. And even if they do win this long victory, this costly victory, and like Michael said, it's going to be a Pyrrhic victory. It's going to be something where the costs are so great and the long-term benefit is not very great at all. So suppose they do manage to occupy Kyiv and occupy Kharkiv and all the other major cities with it, Odessa and things like this. There's going to be a lot of really angry Ukrainians there. So you look at Ukraine's population, there is a significant Russian minority. I think it's around a sixth or so of Ukraine's population. But Russia has also weakened Ukraine by absorbing Crimea, which is the largest Russian population, percentage-wise, of any Ukrainian province. And they recognize the independence of the Donbass regions. So the Luhansk and Donetsk republics, those are where the largest Russian populations were. So Russia just carved out the biggest Russian areas of Ukraine, which means Ukraine now is mostly non-Russian. So the Russian population, ethnic Russian population in Ukraine is much smaller than it was. And so it's very unlikely that this new Ukrainian state, since Russia has carved out Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea, which were the three largest provinces for ethnic Russians, once those are gone, Ukraine's going to be a lot more Ukrainian, a lot more non-Russian, a lot more anti-Russian. So if Russia tries to occupy this country for any length of time, it's going to be very costly. There's going to be a really angry insurgency and well-armed. Some of these NATO weapons have moved into the country. Russia's not going to be able to find them all. These things aren't too easy to discover. And so I think that it's going to be a long, costly insurgency if Russia tries to support, say, a puppet government they install in Kyiv. So I don't think there's going to be a long-term victory for Russia here. They may temporarily control the cities, depose the government, place a government with a pro-Russian government, but especially after carving out the three largest provinces of the Russian population, the rest of Ukraine doesn't have that much of a Russian population, and it's going to be very anti-Russian. There's not going to be much long-term success here, I don't think. I think Russia's best hope is to get a country that's weak enough that'll stay neutral and that won't be able to be a military threat to Russia. But I'm not sure. What do you think about that, Michael?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add, because I think that's exactly right. The only thing I would add really quickly, because I know the question lots of people have is, is this the prelude to a third world war? And I think that, I think the tough time that Russia has had right now in Ukraine makes me more skeptical that we're likely to see Russia, make an aggressive move against Poland or against one of the Baltic republics. I think the last statistic I saw was that Russia had somewhere in the order of about 55% of its total ground fighting force deployed to Ukraine right now. And so at the peak of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think the US was at about 25% of its ground fighting force. So Russia is very much overcommitted. The place where I think that I'm the most worried about the potential for escalation into a wider conflict between Russia and NATO would be more along the lines of there either being kind of a mistake, an accident, or a misinterpretation of intentions. And what I mean by that, one possible scenario I could see would be because the US and NATO are providing lots of military support to the Ukrainians, you have supply routes running through Poland, a NATO country. It's not hard for me to imagine a scenario where Russia might decide that the pain that it's experiencing from, the Stinger missiles or the Javelins or the MLAWs being brought in require them to attack a convoy of military supplies flowing in. And that might set in motion an escalatory process that could result in a wider conflict. That's not guaranteed to happen, but that's the one scenario that I worry about the most. Fortunately, there are channels of communication between the Russian military and the US military in place to talk directly to one another in order to avoid those sorts of accidents. We just had one last week where 4 Russian jets actually intruded on Swedish airspace. In a time of crisis, that's the sort of thing that we worry about as potentially escalatory.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't see either side having any interest in starting full-on NATO versus Russia war. Now, I think Putin would like to have NATO portrayed as the enemy here. And so I think he's doing a lot to kind of blame NATO for all this with the Russian people. And you've probably heard a week or two ago that Russia put its nuclear forces on a higher level of alert, supposedly. Well, that was almost certainly aimed entirely at the Russian people, trying to say, look, we're being tough. And he was hoping to bait the West into a response. So he's hoping the West would see, oh, the Russians are on high alert. We better go on high alert, because that would allow him to say, look, our enemies in NATO just put their nuclear forces on high alert. I've got to protect us. And so I think he's trying to blame the West. And he's often called the Ukrainian government not just Nazis, but also Western puppets. So this government was installed by a NATO-backed coup, and they're Nazis and all sort of stuff. So I think Putin would like to blame the West with the Russian people for domestic consumption, but I don't think he has any interest in a war with the West. And I think the NATO countries are building up their forces in Estonia, Latvia, and so on, to try to make sure Putin realizes you got to be careful here. In Poland, especially, where there's been a lot of focus on U.S. military supplies, NATO military supplies going through Poland into Ukraine, large numbers of refugees going through Poland towards the West. I think NATO is doing what it can to try to warn Putin, don't try to mess with this. And I don't think Putin has any interest in that. I think he wants to be able to win a relatively cheap victory and blame NATO for its problems, but tell the Russian people he's been successful. And so far, he's not winning the cheap victory, but I don't think he wants to go into the real cost of a war against a much larger, much better equipped NATO force. So I'm not too worried about a World War III or direct NATO-Russia war here. Although, like Michael said, there's certainly the risk of mistakes. There's certainly the risk of some unintended or accidental things that could have serious effects. And for example, suppose Russia starts moving against Western Ukraine. So there's a lot of talk about Lviv being the major country near the Polish border, or the major city in Ukraine near the Polish border. Suppose Kyiv falls and Lviv becomes a seat of the Ukrainian government or the Ukrainian resistance there, and Russia moves on Lviv. And once you're that close to the Polish border, there's a very real risk that combat spills over by accident. Artillery shells might actually go over the border when you're trying to attack somebody just on this side of the border, or rockets could be misfired or misaimed. So I think those are the kinds of things that become a real concern. So when NATO has Article 5, if shells start flying across the border even by accident, that becomes a very real concern. But I really do think that would be an unlikely outcome that neither side really has any interest in. So I think unless it is a major accident like that, I think we're probably safe from World War III, but doesn't make it any easier for the Ukrainians right now.
We got a question from the chat, Dr. Landrip. Is that okay?
Yeah, great.
It's regarding the Ukraine and joining the EU. And they're asking, if Russia prevails and perhaps even if they don't, crippling Ukraine's economy, is that an ulterior motive to keep them out of the EU? Or would that motivate the EU to accept Ukraine?
So I think crippling the economy, I think, is very much part of the Russian goal. Because again, and I think this is, Dr. Ansel, I think, made a great point earlier about, in a lot of ways for the Putin regime, having, a successful, vibrant democracy on its border with a vibrant economy is an example of the Russian people that I don't think the Putin government wants to see. And so I think kind of putting in the Ukrainian government in tatters actually benefits that. And then to the fact that if it prevents Ukraine from joining the European Union, so much the better from the Russian perspective. So I think that's really kind of how they see it. I don't know what you think, Paul.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think Putin's objective here, regardless of whether he can depose the regime and impose a permanent pro-Russian regime, which is really unlikely, like we saw earlier, we discussed earlier, I think he really does want to weaken Ukraine. So even if Ukraine's government, now that he's taken out the more pro-Russian provinces, even if Ukraine goes back to a pro-Western government after the war, he wants to weaken it so much that obviously NATO and the European Union have no interest in accepting it in the correct conditions. And the European Union and Ukraine's applied for a fast track to membership. I don't think the European Union wants to add a new member in this current condition in the war or dramatically weakened by the war. We may see closer ties between them. And developing closer ties before this that Dr. Greg talked about in the intro, where in 2013 they were negotiating this deal that Yanukovych ended up vetoing and stopping. So I think we may see closer ties between the European Union and Ukraine, especially after the support that the West has been showing for Ukraine here. But I don't think they're on a path to membership anytime soon. I mean, membership in the European Union often takes several decades to meet all the different steps along the road. So the European Union insists you must do this, meet all these different standards. And I'm not sure how many of them Ukraine meets right now, but in many cases it takes countries at least a decade or more to check off all these boxes, and Ukraine hasn't even started that process yet. So I'd be very surprised to see any rapid progress towards membership, but probably closer ties, sure.
All right, well, I have a question that actually goes along with one of the questions here in the chat, so I'll just combine these. We have a lot of students asking about what more can the U.S. do, including, is there really a risk if we do a no-fly zone that there could be a nuclear war? And we have someone in the chat saying that their son is going to be stationed at Ramstein Air Force Base, which I know is where Poland wanted to transfer those planes to send to Ukraine. So how else can the U.S. become involved without getting us in a nuclear war?
Well, I think right now the West is doing the right thing. I mean, if they want to support Ukraine without escalation, without direct NATO on Russia combat, I think they're doing probably the best they can. So a combination of economic sanctions, which, as Dr. Gregg said earlier, might be probably are, in fact, the most serious sanctions ever imposed on a country in the history of economic sanctions. They're really, really hurting the Russian economy right now. And it's really also really hurting some of Putin's key supporters, some of the oligarchs. So I think the economic sanctions is one important thing to really bring the costs home to the Russian people and to the Russian leadership, the oligarchs and things. And the other thing is giving whatever military aid you can to the Ukrainians to fight their own war. So sending more Javelin or Enlaw or Panzerfaust to some of the other anti-tank weapons that have been sent, sending more Stinger, some of the other anti-aircraft missiles. I think this is the best that they can do if they want to avoid direct combat. And I think a no-fly zone sounds really nice. It sounds pretty neutral. We're just maintaining neither side can fly here. But realistically, what that would mean is putting U.S. forces at risk. Of course, Ukrainians aren't going to shoot down American planes or NATO planes, but you do have to worry about Russians. So if the war doesn't go better for Russia, they're going to keep trying to use their air power, which they have a huge advantage in air power, which hasn't really shown yet, but they have a much bigger, much better equipped air force. And if we try to impose a no-fly zone, that's obviously hurt in the Russian effort much more than the Ukrainian effort in terms of the military, the air force capabilities. And if Russia doesn't want to comply with this, and I don't see why they would want to, they wouldn't agree to a no-fly zone since they would be able to use the airspace more for their advantage. I think this means that we're going to face an unhappy Russia with a lot of warplanes and a lot of anti-aircraft weapons, a lot of surface-to-air missiles. Not only in Ukrainian territory, of course, they're bringing some of these surface-to-air missiles into Ukraine with them, but also from Belarus, also from Russia. So if the U.S. tries to impose a no-fly zone, the first thing you usually do, when we've done this with Iraq and other countries, is wipe out the air defenses first, so that your planes aren't at risk from the ground. You can just maintain control of the air, shoot down any enemy plane that comes towards you. But this would mean taking out a lot of Russian air defenses inside Russia, not just the ones they put in Ukraine. And I think there's a very real risk of escalation there. When you talk about NATO-Russia fighting, that's about as serious as the risk gets there. And so I think NATO wants to avoid that at all costs. So I just don't see a situation where NATO feels willing to take that risk and impose a no-fly zone. Michael, Dr. Gregg?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to describe it. I think there's sort of this view of a no-fly zone as being very kind of sanitized and very neat and clean and not very risky. But I think that's exactly right in terms of the dangers that it poses. I think the things that we can do, actually, the person who asked the question whose son is being deployed to Ramstein, actually I think is a really good example of the kinds of things that the U.S. can do. Military personnel like your son are actually performing a very valuable service, because what they're doing by being deployed, whether it's to Germany or Poland or to the Baltic republics, what they're doing is they're emphasizing the U.S. commitment to protect its allies. And what that does is that communicates very, very clearly to the Russians exactly kind of where the limits are that would draw the U.S. into a wider conflict. And I agree with Dr. Hensel that I don't think the Russians want to see a wider war with the U.S. or with NATO. And so making things as clear and as transparent as possible on the U.S. side, here are the lines, here are the things that we will not tolerate, here are the things that we will do if Russia does something that the U.S. is unwilling to tolerate, I think is the single most important thing that we can do. I think for IR scholars like Dr. Hensel and I think the thing that keeps both of us up at night is uncertainty. We always worry about when actors are uncertain about what another actor is going to do. So the more uncertainty that you have, the worse things are. I want clarity as much as possible. But that's a great question.
I agree with that. Yep.
I think we have some more questions from the chat, so let's take one from there.
Yeah, I've got one, and I was going to combine something else with it. It says, I know you can't read Putin's mind, but do you think the threat of nuclear war is a bluff? And would it really be worth it for him to use nuclear warfare? And then we've also heard in the news the concerning intel that's saying he's going to use biological or chemical weapons. And what do y'all think? Do you think that's the question?
Well, I am grateful that I can't climb into Vladimir Putin's mind, because I don't think that's a pleasant place to be. Yeah, my sense is that I think that this is more of a bluff than anything else. I don't see anything from Vladimir Putin that tells me that he is irrational or suicidal. I think he has misinterpreted events. I think he has misunderstood what would transpire in the event of the invasion. So I don't see kind of a full-scale nuclear exchange between the US and Russia as being very likely. Now, having said that, the one concern that I do have in the nuclear realm is that Russian military doctrine sees nuclear weapons differently than the US does. So there have been some analysts smarter than me that have suggested that Russia considering using tactical nuclear weapons, so nuclear artillery or things like that, might be a possibility. If things get really bad for the Russians in Ukraine, it essentially would be a way for Putin to kind of double down. I think that's possible. I think the reason why I'm still skeptical there is it's hard for me to see what the end game of that actually is for the Russians in a way that benefits them. The amount of devastation that we've seen Russia inflict on Ukrainian cities just through artillery and airstrikes, through conventional weapons, is enormous. So I don't know that they need to use, tactical nuclear weapons to level a Ukrainian city. And so I'm not sure that it's worth the cost of that sort of escalation. So I think that's less likely. I wouldn't take it off the table entirely, but I think that's less likely. I don't know if you agree, Paul.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I think we have a situation where he's made these threats to put the forces on a higher level of alert and this kind of stuff. As I mentioned before, this probably meant for domestic consumption in Russia, rather than seriously trying to talk about a serious risk of nuclear war. So when countries have put these forces on high alert before, it's often been done behind the scenes. So during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, the US reportedly put its forces on higher level of alert, but they didn't announce it publicly. They did it with their normal chain of command, sending an insecure or a non-encrypted message from Washington to the nuclear headquarters saying, guys, go into a higher level of alert. And they knew very well the Russians would intercept this message and know what's going on. And the idea was, we're going to send a subtle message. Guess what, Russia? We're doing this. We don't want this Arab-Israeli war to go in a bad way. We don't want you to intervene on behalf of Egypt and things. And that's what's typically done. You don't typically make it a big public relations thing. We're going on a higher level of alert now. And so the fact that Putin went public with this and told his generals to do this in front of the Russian people, in front of TV cameras, is very clearly meant for the Russian domestic audience. Look, I'm being tough here. I'm worried about, I think NATO's going to try to take advantage of us. I'm going to stop that. And so I don't think he has any clear interest in a full-on nuclear exchange. Now, Michael's point about tactical nuclear weapons, that is a concern, because certainly Russian nuclear doctrine at least has the possibility of that in their rule book, basically. Now, given this war, I have a hard time seeing that. So there's a lot of ethnic Russians in Ukraine, not as many as there were back before Donbass and Crimea left, but especially Kharkiv. Kharkiv, for example, is a city with some of the hardest resistance so far. And it's also 75 or 80% ethnic Russian. And so you could technically use a nuclear weapon to stop the resistance there, but how many ethnic Russians you want to slaughter under the guise of protecting ethnic Russians? And if you want to talk about using it on, say, Kyiv, how does that benefit you if you want to have this friendly regime next to you wipe out the capital city and largest city with nuclear weapons? And so I agree with Dr. Greg here that I don't see a use case here that makes sense for Putin or makes sense for the Russian military. So they certainly have the possibility. They have these tactical weapons and they could use them, or for that matter, chemical weapons and biological weapons. I'm not sure what intelligence that's based on, but so far these warnings from U.S. intelligence have been relatively accurate here. Putin intends to attack here starting this time, and some of those were pretty close. So it's certainly possible that they want to do something like that, but I think I don't see a real use case for that makes a lot of sense to them. And I think it's good that the US or the Western intelligence is putting this out there just to make sure it doesn't get used to suddenly surprise people. Because now if something happens, people are looking for it.
All right, so we also had a series of questions that were asking about how this will end. Is this going to end up with China joining Russia? We're going to have a Cold War where there's a split between us and then Russia and China.
You take this, Michael. You're the complicated guy and the ending guy.
Yeah, so this is the question I really kind of rack my brains with. This is, where kind of what we refer to as kind of a off-ramp is that sort of ends this. So I don't know. It's hard for me to see a negotiated agreement right now that ends this conflict that's acceptable to either side, particularly for the Russian side, because I think the Russians have, the Putin regime, and I keep saying the Russians, but I should really distinguish between the Putin regime and the Russian people. The story the Russian people are being told about this war is very different than what we're seeing here in the West. But it's kind of hard for me to see kind of an agreement that the Putin regime can sign on to that allows them to kind of save face in any real sense just yet. I think in terms of China's kind of an interesting position because, I think we've paid a lot of attention in the West to the improving ties between Russia and China. And I know there's been a lot of concern about, the development of a Russia-China axis and a Russia-China alliance. And I'm really kind of skeptical about that over the long term. I think this is, in a lot of ways, whatever coordination is happening right now between Russia and China is more kind of a marriage of convenience than anything else. China does benefit from, the problems that Russia is creating for the U.S. right now in the moment. It kind of limits the ability of the U.S. to pivot to Asia. Having said that, China is a state that actually kind of benefits from the order in the international system in the way that Russia doesn't. Russia's kind of a force for chaos. The Chinese can't be enthusiastic about spiking oil prices. The Chinese are not enthusiastic about, the risk of an economic recession in the West as this. So I'm not really concerned about over the long term about kind of a deepening Russia-China alliance. I think in the years to come, I still expect that the defining relationship that will be the most important in the U.S. or in the international system will be the U.S.-China relationship. I don't think we're going to go back to a U.S.-Russia Cold War because Russia is a declining power. I still think the defining relationship will still be the U.S. and China. I don't know what you think, Paul.
Yeah, I think China has not really played a very active role in this so far. And what they've been saying is often we look forward to a peaceful solution and things like this, rather than offering to help Russia in any way possible or setting these up for long-term China-Russia cooperation. And I think, like Dr. Greg said, I think China does benefit a lot more from the current economic system, the current international system, than Russia does. And China has become one of the world's great trading power, world's most important trading powers. And it's not clear why China would want to cut that off and put itself at risk of the same kind of sanctions that were put on Russia. So I'm not sure that China is likely to join Russia in any meaningful sense here. There's certainly going to be plenty of U.S.-China competition and lots of U.S.-China issues, but I don't think it's going to be China and Russia working together in any meaningful sense. So I'd agree with that. In terms of the end game for how this ends, a lot depends on the battlefield. I think what Putin's going to be looking for ultimately, if the battlefield doesn't go better over the next few weeks or a month or two, is going to be looking for something he can claim victory, even if it really isn't a meaningful victory. So there may be some sort of deal where Ukraine ends up agreeing to some sort of neutrality status. One example people have mentioned, including our colleague Dr. Ishiyama, is comparing this to Finland of the 1940s. So Finland of the 1940s fought 2 wars against Russia and did far better against Russia's militarily far superior forces than you'd expect. And so there's a real parallel there that everyone expected Russia to wipe Finland off the map quickly, or to at least wipe their military off the map quickly. And they didn't in either one of the wars. And much like Ukraine here. And Finland ended up with a situation where Russia didn't take a hold. They took some territory that they wanted, but they didn't really cripple Finland economically or anything else. But they just required Finland to stay neutral, say during the Cold War and things like this. And Russia may be able to ultimately claim, if they can get Ukraine to agree in some meaningful way to long-term neutrality, that may be enough for Russia to claim victory if they can't get a battlefield victory. So they can say, well, we've made sure that Ukraine will stay neutral, they won't join NATO, they won't join the European Union, and they won't have a large enough military to threaten us. We've safely demilitarized them, we've safely denazified them, whatever they want to claim. I think that if Russia doesn't win on the battlefield, that's the best situation we can hope for, maybe, that the Ukraine comes out of this without too much long-term devastation, and Russia can at least claim that, at least for the short term. But what do you think about that, Michael?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the hard part, though, is for the Ukrainian side, adopting that neutral status, would have been a lot easier to do before the Russian invasion, after you've sort of suffered. So, Yeah, but I actually think that Dr. Hansel's point at the very beginning of our discussion is a really important one, that we keep thinking about this in terms of Ukraine being neutral and not joining NATO. But I actually think that Dr. Hansel is exactly right, that it's actually about Ukraine joining the European Union that's even more important. And that's a lot harder for, even if Ukraine were to sign on to an agreement today that says we'll never join the EU, it's hard to imagine Ukraine being able to live up to that agreement 10, 15, 20 years from now. And so that makes the settlement really difficult here.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I think we're about out of time. We have so many more questions, so you may be receiving some email follow-up from both
Sure,
professors.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you guys helping explain this as it's happening. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for all the questions. These are great questions to ask. I'm really glad we could help with them.
Yeah, we really appreciated the time. It was great to see such terrific questions, and it's wonderful to see people really interested in important things happening around the world. So we're really glad to do it.
Thank you.
And I'm going to put a link in the chat so those students in attendance can fill it out for their professors. So students, don't leave just yet, okay? And thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Well, have a good day.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Y'all give me just a minute. I'm trying to find it in my email.
I'm going to try to put together a list of just sort of generic representative questions to send them just a few more, because we had some really good questions, so that we can do that via email.
Julie? Wow, why are you doing this? Okay, I finally got the link to work, you guys. I just put it in the chat. So those of you that are students are attending, please make sure you fill it out. You should see it in the chat. Let me know if you have any issues. Thank you all for attending. Appreciate your attendance.